Hello, my friend. Hi there. Good evening. Wherever you might be listening from, perhaps a quiet room, dimly lit, perhaps with the soft hum of the night pressing against the window. Or maybe you're lying somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, letting the day's noise recede like the tide pulling away from the shore. If so, let it go, let it ebb. Because for the next little while, we are going to drift together, not forward into tomorrow, but backward into a time where comfort was a distant dream and cleanliness was an almost mythical luxury. But before we step over that threshold of years, let me ask you something, not with urgency, but with the kind of slow curiosity you might have while staring into the surface of a cup of tea. Have you ever wondered what it means to feel truly clean? Not just in the way we mean it today, a shower in the morning, a towel fresh from the dryer, clothes that smell faintly of detergent, but clean in the sense of having washed away every reminder of the day's sweat, dust, and contact with others. And if you have felt that, can you imagine the opposite? Not just a skipped shower or two, but the long, unbroken wait of weeks, even months without soap, without a change of fabric against your skin, without the simple act of running water over your hands, without counting each drop. The world in which we live makes such deprivation almost unthinkable. Even in difficult times, even in hardship, there is often some corner of our day where we can find a moment of cleanliness. But the refugee camps of the Second World War, they were not such a world. They were places where the very idea of being clean became almost absurd, a thing to remember from another life, like the taste of ripe fruit in the depth of winter. And yet, people lived there. Not just for a few nights or a passing season, but for years that stretched out like a gray horizon. They woke each day, not into safety, but into survival. They learned the ways of the lice that nested in seams and hairlines, the stubborn grit that clung to skin as if it had grown there, the coughs and fevers that passed from body to body like whispered rumors. And still, they woke. They spoke. They dreamed. But we are not rushing there yet. For now, I want you to imagine the edges first. Close your eyes if you wish. Picture Europe, not as you see it now with its polished glass, its soft-lit cafes, its ordered streets, but as it was under the shadow of war. Roads thick with mud or dust, depending on the season, rail tracks trembling under the weight of trains carrying not holiday passengers, but the displaced, the desperate, the ones with nowhere else to go. These camps, whether hurriedly assembled on the outskirts of towns, or hidden deep in forests, or stretched across barren fields, were meant to be temporary. But temporary in wartime is a word without a clock. For some, the temporary became their whole existence. The ground beneath their shelters hardened into the shape of their footsteps. The walls, if you could call them that, absorbed the sound of their voices until even the air seemed to know them. And the dirt became part of the architecture. You see, dirt in a refugee camp was not simply something that fell from boots or clung to hems. It was a living presence. It swirled into the air when the wind moved. It settled into bedding, into the folds of whatever clothing a person owned. It crept under fingernails, into ears, into the faint lines of skin around the eyes. You could not keep it out. You could only learn to live with it, the way one learns to live with an ache that will not heal. And then there were the lice. If dirt was the ground's gift to the refugees, lice were its unwelcome ambassadors. Small, tireless, unashamed. They thrived in places where washing was rare, where fabric was worn day after day, where the warmth of bodies pressed together in overcrowded shelters gave them the perfect climate. They were not, as some might think, just a nuisance. In the camps, lice were the heralds of disease. Typhus was their silent partner, and it could sweep through a population already weakened by hunger and cold, taking with it the young, the old, and the unlucky. But perhaps we should not start with disease. That is too sharp an edge for now. Let us move slowly, the way the dusk moves into night, barely noticed, until you realize the world has changed color. Imagine instead the sounds first, the murmur of many voices in many languages, drifting through the thin walls of canvas or timber. The coughs, the shuffling of feet over packed earth, the faint, unending creak of something being mended, a coat, a pair of shoes, a piece of shelter wall. In these camps, people made their own rhythm. The rising at dawn, not to the smell of breakfast, but to the need to fetch water before the queue became impossibly long. the careful rationing of soap, if there was any at all, sometimes traded for food, sometimes guarded like treasure. The quiet moments when someone might sit in a shaft of sunlight, turning their shirt inside out to let it air, hoping that the warmth might drive away at least a few of the insects. There is a temptation, when we think of history, to imagine it as a series of grand events, the battles, the treaties, the speeches. But life, even in its most extreme circumstances, is still lived moment to moment. And in the camps, those moments were often small, repetitive, but deeply human. A mother braiding her daughter's hair with fingers stiff from cold. A boy scratching at the seam of his trousers while trying to listen to an elder's story. An old man holding a tin cup not for drinking, but for catching the faint drips of rainwater from the edge of a shelter, as though each drop might carry something precious. I want you to hold that image of the smallness, the closeness, the constant negotiation with discomfort as we step deeper into their world. Because the dirt, the lice, the disease, they were not isolated afflictions. They were part of an entire ecosystem of hardship. And yet, within that ecosystem, people found ways to speak, to laugh quietly, to mark the passage of time. Even in the absence of soap and clean linen, there were rituals. Not the grand ceremonies of peacetime, but modest acts of reclaiming dignity. A man wiping his hands on a scrap of cloth before touching a shared loaf of bread. A woman shaking out a blanket, not because it would be clean afterward, but because it was something she could do, a way to say, this space, this moment, still belongs to us. And you, sitting here, perhaps listening in the comfort of a bed, or a chair in a room that is your own. You can cross that distance in your mind, if you wish. You can imagine what it would be to live in such a place, not as a visitor, but as someone for whom the horizon is bounded by barbed wire, and the scent of damp, unwashed bodies is as constant as your own breathing. But let's not hurry. There is much to see, much to feel in this world before we leave it. For the story of the refugee camps in the Second World War is not only one of suffering, though there is plenty of that, but one of the extraordinary ways in which humans adapt, endure, and carry fragments of normal life into the most abnormal places. And tonight, if you'll walk with me, we will explore it together. Slowly, as the night stretches on, and the world beyond your window grows quiet. When you arrive in a place that will become your prison without bars, the first thing you notice is not the sight, but the air. It meets you before anything else does. A muted, unwelcoming handshake, heavy with the sense of too many bodies, of ground worn thin by constant footsteps, of fires that burn more smoke than warmth. You do not yet know the routines here, the way the queues coil in the mornings, the way people fold their thin blankets to mark a place in a shelter, the way water arrives or doesn't. You only know that the air does not move as freely as it should. It lingers, as though it too has been captured. You carry what little you own in bundles or sacks, the fabric scratching against your palms, and the dirt underfoot feels different from any dirt you have walked on before. It is more than earth. It is a layer of exhaustion, pressed flat by thousands of souls, littered with the half-buried traces of other people's days. A button, a scrap of cloth, a footprint filled with yesterday's rain. Somewhere ahead, a fence leans, not with the rigid defiance of new construction, but with the weary slump of something that has seen too many seasons, too many storms, and too many hands gripping its wire. You do not rush forward. No one here does. Movement is measured, partly by fatigue, partly by the weight of uncertainty. Those who have been here longer carry themselves differently. They do not glance around with wide eyes, for they already know the limits of what there is to see. Their faces have the stillness of water that has long since stopped expecting a change in the wind. They watch you with a kind of distant interest, as though gauging whether you will add to the sum of their troubles or merely blend into the background. Somewhere, a child is crying, the sound thin and persistent, without the rising and falling notes of a tantrum, the kind of cry that comes from hunger or cold, things that cannot be soothed with a parent's arm alone. You catch fragments of language, not always your own, in low, murmured conversations, the syllables shaped by fatigue as much as by accent. A soldier or a guard, the distinction blurs here, motions for you to move toward a certain row of shelters. They are not homes. They are arrangements of necessity, Walls made from whatever material the place can offer. Canvas, timber, corrugated metal patched together like the mismatched thoughts in the mind of someone who can no longer plan beyond the next day. Inside, the light is dim, even when the sun is high. The air is warmer than outside, but not in a way that speaks of comfort. It is the kind of warmth that grows from too many people breathing in too small a space. The smell is layered smoke from cooking fires, unwashed bodies, damp clothing, the faint acidic tang that speaks of waste, not entirely contained. You set your things down in the space you are given. There is no ceremony to it. This spot is not yours in any permanent sense, only until someone with more authority or more desperation decides otherwise. The ground beneath you is hard. Whatever straw or fabric has been placed here has long since flattened under the press of bodies. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint, restless sound of scratching. It might be a person adjusting their clothing, or it might be the smaller, tireless residents of this place, the lice, always moving, always seeking warmth. You will come to know them intimately soon enough, but for now, you simply notice the movement, the way it blends into the background like the constant hiss of the wind through a loose seam in the wall. Outside, the camp has its own slow rhythm, not dictated by clocks but by the demands of survival. At dawn, the queue for water forms, and if you join it too late, you will wait twice as long for half as much. The water itself is not what you might hope for. It carries the taste of its journey, sometimes metallic, sometimes earthy, sometimes faintly bitter, as though the containers used to bring it here have given it their own signature. People drink it anyway. You will too. Hunger does not wait politely for clean water, and thirst is far less patient. Food is distributed in the same way: long lines, slow movement, and the unspoken calculation of whether you will trade some of your ration for something else you need more urgently, like a scrap of soap, or a needle to mend clothing, or even a moment's favor from someone who can make your next day a little easier. In these first days, you notice the dirt most when you try to remove it. You wipe your hands on a cloth and find that the cloth darkens, but your skin feels no different. You shake out your blanket and a cloud of dust rises, catching the light for a moment before settling back down exactly where it came from. It is as though the camp itself resists your efforts, as though it insists that everything here must share the same dull, muted hue. And the more you try to hold yourself apart from it, the more you see how futile that will be. People do not talk much about cleanliness here. It is not that they have forgotten the concept, but that they have set it aside, like a coat that no longer fits and cannot be mended. You sleep, if you sleep at all, to the sound of others shifting nearby. Sometimes there is the soft murmur of someone praying, not always in a language you know, but the cadence is enough to tell you what it island. Sometimes there is coughing, the dry kind and the wet kind, each with its own rhythm. You begin to learn the sounds without trying, to separate the ordinary from the dangerous. A long, rattling breath in the night will make you turn your head, even if you do not mean to. You think of the diseases you have heard whispered about: typhus, dysentery, things that spread quickly when the body is already worn thin, and you try not to think too long about how close you are to everyone else. Days here do not end so much as they fold into one another. Without the markers of ordinary life, no changing of clothes, no fresh scent after bathing, no familiar streets to walk, time becomes a blur. You count the days by the changes in the weather, the way the wind feels sharper one morning, or the way the sun lingers a little longer in the evening. You begin to recognize faces, even if you do not know names. You see who tends to sit near the cooking fires, who lingers near the water queue, who disappears into the far corners of the camp for hours at a time. There is a kind of unspoken map here, invisible to newcomers, but clear to those who have been here long enough to survive without attracting the wrong kind of attention. And in this slow immersion, you realize that the camp itself is not a static place. It breathes in its own way. It has a pulse, not quick, not strong, but steady. The pulse is in the morning shuffling of feet, in the midday lull when the heat presses everyone into stillness. In the evening, murmur when small groups gather to exchange whatever news has drifted in from outside. The dirt shifts under every step. The smoke drifts and curls differently depending on the wind. The shadows from the fences stretch and shrink. You are part of it now, whether you acknowledge it or not. In the first week, perhaps, you will still think of leaving. You will imagine a sudden change. A letter. A messenger. A door that opens. You will imagine stepping away from this place and into a street where the air is clean, the clothes are fresh, and the only dirt on your hands is from honest work in a garden. But as the days slip by, that vision will become less vivid. The camp will press itself into you, not as a wound, but as a second skin. The lice, the dirt, the smell, they will become so constant that you will no longer notice them every moment. In the same way, you do not notice your own heartbeat unless it changes. And that is when you will understand that this place has begun to claim you. You begin to notice, after the first stretch of days has seeped into you, that the camp's life is less a matter of schedules and more a quiet choreography of needs. The barter emerges first in whispers, not in open exchanges. It starts when you see a woman leaning close to another by the water queue, her hand closed tight around something small and pale in color, her eyes darting as though the dirt beneath their feet might overhear. Later, you learn it was a sliver of soap, no bigger than a thumb joint, traded for half a loaf of bread. Soap here is worth more than coin. Coin is useless where there is nothing to buy, but soap holds the suggestion of an impossible luxury, the chance to strip away, even briefly, the skin-deep evidence of this place. You see it in the way people handle it, not wasting a scrap, using it with the slow reverence of someone folding a fragile letter from home. Water is a currency of its own. The official supply is thin and always tastes faintly of whatever container it last rested in: tin, rust, wood. But there are other ways to get it. If you know the right person, or if you have something they want, you might be told of a rain barrel kept behind a cluster of shelters, where the drops are caught directly from the sky, untainted by pipes or barrels. The water there is never abundant, but it is cleaner, and people will trade more than you'd think for a single cup of it. A scrap of wool to patch a sleeve, a handful of dried beans, a few minutes of help carrying firewood, small things. But in the camp, nothing is small. Every object, every effort, is a piece of a fragile net you weave to keep yourself from falling through the cracks entirely. And then there are the survival tricks, the kind people do not speak of loudly, not because they are shameful, but because they are too valuable to give away freely. You learn from watching. A man sits on the edge of his shelter, his shirt laid flat across his knees. He holds it in the sun, pressing the seams with his fingers, turning it slowly. At first you think he is drying it, but then you realize he is baking the lice. The heat drives them to the surface, and with a swift, practiced pinch, he crushes them between his nails. It is an endless task, one that must be repeated day after day, for there is no final victory here, only the brief reprieve before they return. Some people sprinkle ash from the cooking fires into the seams of their clothing. It dulls the fabric's color, makes it scratchier against the skin, but the lice dislike it, and so the wearer endures the discomfort for the sake of fewer bites. Others sleep with their hair bound tightly, or shaved entirely if they can bear the loss, because lice love warmth and cover. Children, of course, are the hardest to keep free of them. They do not yet have the discipline to sit still while someone searches through their hair, and they wriggle away from the fingers that try to keep them clean. You see mothers gripping their children's chins gently but firmly, tilting their heads toward the light, their own eyes narrowed in concentration as they search for the pale, quick movement at the roots. Disease moves differently here. It does not rush in with sirens and alarm. It seeps, slow but certain, the way dampness spreads through a blanket. A cough becomes 2, then 10, then 20. The sound threads itself through the camp, so that even in the quietest hours, it lingers. People begin to mark time by the changes in someone's breathing, the way their voice grows hoarse, the way their movements slow. And yet, most keep going until they cannot. Rest is a luxury. In the same way food is something you must earn through barter, favor, or sheer force of will. To be still too long is to risk your place in the unspoken order of things. The latrines are a constant source of trouble. They are dug in haste, maintained in fits and starts, and when the weather turns wet, they overflow in ways you try not to think about. Flies come in waves, their buzzing so persistent it becomes a background hum. People wave them away from food, from faces, from wounds, but it is a battle no one wins for long. You notice the ones who seem less bothered by it, not because the flies avoid them, but because they have stopped reacting. That is another form of survival here. The ability to let discomfort pass through you without flinching, without showing that it has touched you. At night, the camp feels smaller. The fires burn low, shadows deepen, and the air cools enough that the damp creeps in through every seam and fold. Conversations turn quieter, and the barter continues in even softer tones. Someone trades a candle stub for a strip of cloth. Someone else swaps a handful of nails for a tin cup. In the dim light, the objects look almost the same, colorless, ordinary but in daylight. Each will have its purpose, its place in the intricate economy that keeps this fragile community standing. You begin to see how disease is tied to every choice. A cup of cleaner water might keep a fever at bay. A piece of soap might mean fewer bites, and fewer bites mean fewer chances for typhus to take hold. A bit of ash in the seams of your clothing might not only let you sleep better, but might save you from joining the line of those too weak to rise in the morning. And yet, these are not certainties. They are small, fragile wagers against the weight of circumstance. The longer you stay, the more you notice that survival here is not about grand gestures or bold acts. It is about the accumulation of small, almost invisible decisions. Whether you trade your last scrap of bread for a needle, whether you spend an extra hour waiting for the cleaner water instead of taking what is handed to you first, whether you risk speaking to someone who might have something you need, knowing that every request comes with a cost, sometimes more than you can afford, and always, under it all, the dirt remains. It is the constant from which all other troubles branch. It seeps into the fabric of clothing, into the lines of skin, into the very air you breathe. You can close your eyes, turn away from the lice, ignore the coughs for a while, but the dirt is everywhere. It is the floor you sleep on, the walls that shield you, the ground beneath the water queue. It settles over your food in a thin, tasteless film. It marks you in ways that no soap, however precious, can fully erase while you are here. You come to understand that the barter, the tricks, the constant watchfulness, they are not about erasing the dirt or the disease. They are about keeping just enough of it at bay to wake up again tomorrow and do it all over. And in that strange, quiet realization, you see the truth of this place. Survival is not a battle to win, but a rhythm to keep. You keep it with every trade, every trick, every choice to move or to stay still. You keep it with the quiet understanding that there is no finish line, only the next day, and the next, and the next. In time, you begin to notice that the camp is not just a place of bodies and shelters and queues, but of invisible maps, drawn not on paper but in glances. In who steps aside, for whom, in whose voice carries a weight that others will not challenge. These hierarchies are not announced. No one pins a sign to their chest declaring their influence. They exist in subtler ways: who gets the news first when a new delivery of supplies arrives, who is quietly warned about an inspection before it happens, who can cross from one corner of the camp to another without being stopped or questioned. Authority here is rarely given by official hands. It is earned, or taken, or grown over time like moss along a stone wall, so slowly that by the time you see it clearly, it has already covered the surface. And yet, even those who hold some sway are still prisoners of the same dirt, the same lice, the same shortages. Power here does not remove you from the conditions, it only changes how you navigate them. Alliances form like knots in a rope, binding people together not through affection, though that sometimes happens, but through necessity. A man with a knack for fixing torn boots finds himself shadowed by those who carry rumors from the guards. A woman with a talent for coaxing more warmth from a small fire becomes the quiet partner of someone who knows which shelters are least likely to be searched. Trust is not the foundation, usefulness, island. And yet, there is a kind of intimacy in it, because usefulness here is never abstract. It is tied to survival, and survival is the most personal currency of all. You may not like the one who slips you a piece of news, but you will take it, and they will know you owe them something in return. Dignity becomes a delicate thing, not because it disappears entirely, but because it must be rebuilt each day in fragments. You see it in the way an old man smooths his hair with a bit of water before stepping into the main path of the camp, as if reminding himself and others that he is still someone worth looking at. You hear it in the voice of a mother teaching her child to greet the elders properly, even when there is nothing to offer but a nod. You feel it in the slow, deliberate way someone might fold a blanket, even if it is frayed at every edge, as though the act of folding is a statement that disorder will not claim everything. These acts are not grand. They do not change the camp, but they keep something alive inside the people who do them, and that may be the difference between enduring and unraveling. There are rituals here that no one planned, yet they repeat with such regularity that they become part of the camp's heartbeat. In the evenings, as the light thins and the fires take on their slow, patient glow, people gather in small clusters, sometimes just 2 or 3, sometimes more. They talk. Not about escape, such talk is rare, because hope is rationed even more tightly than food, but about the days before the camp, about the places they once called home, the smell of their own kitchens, the sound of familiar bells. The words are often the same, repeated in the same order, as if by keeping the details alive in speech, they might keep them from fading entirely in memory. And perhaps they do, for there are faces here that seem to light from within when they describe a street they have not seen in years. The children, for their part, carve their own territories in this world of scarcity. They learn quickly where they can run without being chased, where the ground dips just enough to hide a game of marbles or a scrap of cloth they've claimed as their own. They turn discarded tin into toys, lines in the dirt into playing fields. To an outside eye, it might look like play as anywhere else. But you can hear the difference in their laughter. It is not unbroken, not the careless sound of a life untouched by want. It comes in bursts, and it fades quickly, as though even joy must be mindful of the camp's limits. Disease is always a shadow, but it does not stop these quiet acts of life. Instead, it shapes them, makes them cautious, teaches them to keep a step's distance, to turn their faces slightly when speaking, to pass objects with a hand wrapped in cloth. The camp learns to move like this without discussion, a collective instinct that grows from too many shared losses. When someone falls ill, the gap around them widens, and yet the watchfulness increases eyes, checking whether they are worse today than yesterday, whether the fever has broken or risen. Sometimes, there is a silent pact to keep the sick person in the rhythm as long as possible, helping them sit by the fire, giving them a place in the queue, as if pretending they are not as close to the edge as they are might hold them back from it. And through all of it, the dirt, the lice, the smell, they remain. But now, you start to see how people shape their relationship to them. There are those who resist constantly, scraping the dirt from their nails, crushing the lice each night, trying to keep the smell at bay with herbs or smoke. There are those who surrender to it, letting the layers of grime and insect bites become part of their skin, as if by embracing it fully they can dull its sting. Most drift between the two, resisting when they have the strength, yielding when they do not. It is not defeat, it is conservation, the quiet arithmetic of deciding which battles to fight today and which to save for tomorrow. You realize that in such a place, alliances and dignity are not luxuries, they are lifelines. Without them, the days would collapse into a shapeless mass of hunger and waiting. With them, there is at least a thread to follow, a reason to rise and take another step into the camp's narrow paths. And as you watch the knots tighten and loosen, the rituals repeat. The quiet gestures of dignity reappear like stubborn green shoots through cracked earth. You begin to understand that even in the most stripped-down version of life, people will build something that is theirs. It may be small, it may be fragile, but it is a claim against the void. And that claim, in the slow hours before sleep, is as real as any wall or roof. The seasons in the camp do not simply pass, they impose themselves, each one arriving not as a gentle change, but as a new set of terms under which everyone must live. The first shift you feel is in the air, its weight, its sharpness, the way it clings to or retreats from your skin. In summer, the heat settles over the camp like an extra layer of fabric that no one asked for, thick and heavy, pressing sweat from your body before the day has even properly begun. The smell grows denser then, not because people are less inclined to wash, but because there is nothing left to wash with. And even if there were, the water would be warm and unsatisfying, running over the skin like a mockery of relief. Flies multiply with the heat, gathering in clouds that follow the scent of food, of waste, of life itself. They land where they please, on faces, on lips, on the open mouth of a sleeping child, and each flick of the hand to shoo them away is as temporary as the breath that follows. In summer, dust becomes its own inhabitant. It rises from the ground in small, lazy spirals every time a foot disturbs it, settling back over hair, over bedding, over the few possessions that remain. No matter how still you try to be, you cannot escape it. It travels on the wind from one corner of the camp to another, bringing with it the dry taste of soil and ash. It cakes at the corners of eyes, lines the inside of mouths, turns each swallow into something you must push past. And yet, people learn to endure it, to speak through it, to share a piece of bread without complaint when it crunches faintly between their teeth. Autumn arrives with a different kind of heaviness. The heat breaks, but in its place comes dampness, creeping in slowly until every scrap of fabric, every inch of shelter, carries the faint chill of water that never fully evaporates. The dirt turns to mud beneath your feet, pulling at shoes until the leather or cloth gives way. Clothing grows heavier as it absorbs the moisture in the air. And fires become more than a comfort, they become necessary to keep the slow ache of cold from settling too deep into bones. In these months, the barter shifts. Dry kindling is worth more than food in some trades, and a strip of cloth that can keep the rain from dripping down the back of your neck is a prize worth guarding. The damp brings its own sickness, coughs deepen, fevers rise more easily, and the air smells faintly of mildew where fabric hangs too long without drying. Winter does not announce itself so much as descend in a single night, turning water to ice and breath to mist. The camp grows quieter in the cold, not because there is less to say, but because speaking takes more effort when the air itself feels sharp enough to cut the inside of your throat. Faces disappear beneath whatever can be wrapped around them, and eyes peer out from above scarves or folds of fabric, watching for signs of frostbite, for the slow clumsiness that means someone is too cold to think clearly. Fires are never enough. The heat they give is small and fleeting, and as soon as you step away, the cold reclaims you with patient hands. In the shelters, bodies press closer together, not for affection, but to share warmth, though even then the nights are long and restless. In winter, the lice do not vanish, they burrow deeper, seeking the heat of skin beneath layers of cloth, and their bites feel sharper against the rawness of winter-chapped flesh. Spring comes as something almost cruel. The first thaw turns the ground to a thick, sucking mud that swallows shoes whole if you are careless. The snowmelt floods the low places in the camp, carrying with it whatever the winter had hidden: waste, scraps, the remains of things long forgotten. The smell changes again, becoming sharper, fouler, as the thaw wakes what the cold had numbed. People are forced to rebuild paths through the camp, laying down planks or stones if they can find them, or else wading through the muck with feet that never quite dry. But spring also brings the first warmth that stays, the first sunlight that lingers on faces without biting. Green pushes through the edges of the camp, small shoots that seem impossibly delicate in this place. For a moment, they are a reminder that life continues elsewhere in the world, even here, where it has been reduced to its most stubborn form. Each season changes the sound of the camp. In summer, there is the constant drone of flies, the cough softened by dust. In autumn, the drip of water from shelter roofs, the squelch of footsteps in mud. In winter, the sharp crunch of frozen ground under boots, the hiss of breath through cloth. In spring, the slow sucking of mud releasing a footstep, the tentative laughter of someone who feels the sun on their face for the first time in months. These sounds become part of the body's memory, so that even years later, in another place entirely, they can return with startling clarity, pulling you back into the narrow paths and low roofs of the camp. The seasons also shape the way people treat each other. In summer, tempers fray in the heat, and small slights become larger under the relentless press of sweat and dust. In autumn, people share warmth more readily, the barter softening slightly as the need for comfort outweighs the need to hold on to every scrap. In winter, survival narrows, the focus alliances tighten, but suspicion grows toward those who might drain more heat, more fuel, more food than they give in return. In spring, there is a brief loosening again, a tentative hope that perhaps the coming months will be kinder. though everyone knows it will not last. You come to see that the camp is not the same place from one season to the next. Its geography shifts with the weather. The high ground becomes more valuable in the floods of spring, the shaded corners in the burning heat of summer, the wind-sheltered paths in the knife-edge cold of winter. The barter follows these changes, as do the alliances, and so does the rhythm of each day. What remains constant is the dirt, the lice, the underlying hunger. But even they change their nature with the seasons: dust one month, mud the next, cold grit beneath fingernails, damp grit clinging to skin. Living through these cycles teaches you something you did not expect, that endurance is not a single act, but a series of adjustments, each one made quietly, without fanfare. It is learning to sleep with your feet wrapped in rags in winter, to keep your head covered from flies in summer, to ration firewood in autumn, to place stones beneath your bedding in spring, to keep it above the floodwater. None of these acts will save you on their own, but together they carry you from one season to the next. And in this place, reaching the next season is as close to victory as most will ever come. Night in the camp is not the same as silence. It arrives slowly, stretching itself over the roofs of shelters and the packed paths between them. But it never quite manages to still everything. The day's heat or cold clings to the ground, leaking upward in invisible threads, carrying with it the smells that the dark cannot hide: wood smoke that is sunk into fabric, the faint sourness of bodies kept too long in the same clothes, the lingering breath of cooking fires long since gone out. Lamps, when there are any, are low and dim, more for the comfort of their glow than for the light they give. Most people sit in shadow, faces turned toward each other, their expressions half concealed, as though the night demands a certain economy of openness. The camp moves differently then. Steps are slower, more deliberate, as if sound travels farther after sundown. Voices are lower, but they carry with a strange clarity through the still air, so that even from a distance you can hear the shape of a conversation without catching the words. It is after dark that the smaller trades take place, the ones that cannot happen under the eyes of authority or in the crush of daylight cues. Someone will knock softly at a shelter wall, slipping inside to exchange a small bundle for another, a strip of cloth for a twist of dried herbs, a stub of candle for a handful of kindling. These are not dramatic bargains, but in the camp's economy they are weighty. Each trade a recalibration of what tomorrow might feel like. The night gives them a privacy the day refuses. In darkness, you can take something from one pair of hands and place something into another without it becoming part of the camp's restless gossip. There are also words exchanged at night that would not survive the daylight. Complaints about the guards, whispered warnings about sickness, quiet admissions of fear. The dark seems to make it easier to speak the things that are too heavy to carry alone, though even then, nothing is said without calculation. Trust, in the camp, is never absolute. It is a currency with its own rate of exchange, and the night is when people are most willing to spend a little of it. Sometimes, two people will lean close, their heads nearly touching, speaking so quietly that even the air between them seems strained to catch the sound. Then they part, not with farewells, but with the same small nods they might give each other in passing during the day, as if nothing at all has been shared. The grief of the camp is most visible at night, but not in loud displays. It is in the way someone sits alone, head bowed over their knees, their breathing slow and deep, as though they are trying to keep themselves from coming apart. It is in the stillness of a blanket, where earlier there was movement, the sudden absence of a cough or a voice you had grown used to. The dark absorbs these losses without ceremony, and the camp does not gather to mourn, not because they do not feel it, but because grief here is private, and to make it public would be to risk tearing the thin fabric that holds the days together. In the dark, the dead leave space in the air, and the living breathe around it. Children, who by day create their own territories of play and noise, move differently after sundown. They huddle closer to their families, their games silenced not by command but by instinct, as though they sense that the night belongs to another rhythm entirely. Their small voices are fewer, their questions whispered instead of spoken aloud. The older ones sometimes take on errands under cover of dark, delivering a message, carrying something from one shelter to another. It is a kind of apprenticeship in the camp's nocturnal life, learning which paths are safest when the light has gone. which shadows belong to people who will ignore you and which belong to those who will not. The night also has its own dangers, subtle but constant. Sickness moves more quietly after dark, hidden in the shiver beneath a blanket, in the faint rattle of breath that only the closest listener will hear. Cold, too, is a thief in the night, pulling the warmth from bodies already weakened by hunger, settling into bones before the mind has time to wake fully. Some people combat it by sleeping in shifts, one always tending the fire, the other wrapped in as many layers as they can find. Others simply lie close, measuring their rest in the rhythm of another's breathing. When the moon is visible, it throws the camp into a different kind of relief. Shadows stretch long across the ground, fences and roofs turning into dark, jagged shapes against the pale light. It becomes possible to see farther, but not necessarily more clearly. The moonlight hides as much as it reveals, washing faces into masks of silver and shadow. On those nights, movement slows even more, as though everyone is aware that the camp itself is more exposed, every gesture more visible to anyone who cares to watch. And yet, for all the quiet transactions, the whispered confidences, the solitary griefs, there is also a strange kind of peace in the camp at night. Without the noise of the day, the shouting, the coughing, the shuffling cues, the mind can wander a little farther. People sit outside their shelters, looking up at a slice of sky, tracing constellations they remember from before, or simply following the slow drift of clouds. Some hum softly to themselves, not quite songs, more like the memory of songs, half forgotten but still carrying a rhythm that feels like home. In these moments, the camp seems to loosen its grip just slightly, as if acknowledging that even here, in the midst of dirt and scarcity, there is a part of each person that remains beyond its reach. The night ends not with a sudden shift, but with the slow arrival of light that leaks in from the edges of the sky. Fires burn low, their embers reduced to faint glows, and the camp stirs reluctantly, as though the dark has been a blanket no one wants to fold away. The trades pause. The conversations fade. The private griefs are pulled back behind the day's mask of necessity. And with that, the night's secrets sink into the ground, waiting for darkness to return so they can surface again. There are rules in the camp, though you will not find them written anywhere, nor hear them recited by anyone in authority. They live instead in the way people glance at one another before stepping into line, in the space left between certain shelters, in the silence that falls when the wrong name is spoken too close to the wrong ear. These rules are not laws in the formal sense. There are no documents, no signatures, no guards to read them aloud, but they are laws in the way gravity is a law, unseen, constant, and indifferent to whether you agree with them. They are enforced not by force of arms, but by the weight of the community itself, a pressure that can shift from gentle guidance to suffocating punishment without warning. One of the first rules you learn is about food, not just how much you take, but how you take it. There is a rhythm to the cues, an order that may not match the logic of fairness, but is nonetheless respected. Cut ahead without permission, and you will not be shouted at immediately. Instead, you will feel the eyes on your back. Will notice that when your turn comes, the portion is smaller, the crust harder, the ladle dipped with less generosity. The camp remembers these small betrayals, and it repays them in kind, quietly, in ways that cannot be traced to a single hand. The next time you are ill, you will find that no one thought to save you a place in line. When the rain comes, the extra scrap of canvas you hoped for will be given to someone else. Another unspoken law governs the use of water. Officially, it is rationed equally, but in truth, water flows according to a network of subtle debts and favors. Wasted in plain sight, wash your hands too long, rinse your hair when others can see, and the murmurs will start. At first, they will be about your carelessness, but soon they will be about your character, your worthiness, your right to be here at all. And when the time comes to draw water again, you may find yourself at the end of the line, or that the barrel runs dry just as your turn arrives. In a place where every drop is fought for, no one forgets who has treated it lightly. There are rules, too, about speech, not only what you say, but where and to whom. The camp has its own geography of voices, places where talk can flow freely, and others where it must be measured. Near the guards, you speak only what is safe, and even then, sparingly. Near the older residents, you avoid boasting. They have seen too many promises dissolve to believe in easy confidence. And there are names you do not say aloud, unless you are prepared for the silence that follows. Some are the names of those who have left under mysterious circumstances, others the names of people who hold more influence than they show. In a world where power is rarely visible, you learn to listen for it in the spaces between words. Theft is not as straightforward here as it might seem. Everyone takes something from someone else, eventually an extra ember from another's fire, a scrap of cloth left unattended, a sip of water when the owner's back is turned. The real crime is not in the taking, but in the taking without balance. If you borrow and never return, if you take and do not offer something in its place, the camp will turn against you. No one will confront you directly. Instead, you will find doors closed where they once opened, faces turned away, hands that once reached out no longer doing so. It is a slow, deliberate exile, carried out while you are still surrounded by people. Some rules are tied to the invisible hierarchy that runs through the camp. There are people whose protection you do not test, not because they carry weapons, but because their reach is longer than yours. Align yourself with them, and you may gain a measure of safety but offend them, and you will find that the small favors that keep you alive vanish one by one. This is not a place where you can survive entirely alone. Even the strongest here lean on others, and the rules exist to keep that fragile network from unraveling. Punishments, when they come, are rarely loud. They do not need to be. There is no cell to lock you in, no official sentence to declare. Instead, the punishment is the quiet removal of the threads that tie you to the camp's life. You may wake to find your place in the queue taken, your shelter space reduced, your allies gone. You may find that news no longer reaches you until it is too late to act on it. These are sentences without end dates. They last until the camp decides you have paid enough, and sometimes that day never comes. The most important rule, the one no one says aloud but everyone knows, is that survival is not only about you. The camp can tolerate the selfish for a time, but never the reckless. To endanger others by hoarding too much, by bringing disease closer, by provoking those with real power, is to put yourself outside the circle entirely. And once you are outside, there is no way back. You might still walk the same paths, eat the same food, sleep in the same shadows, but you will no longer be part of the camp. You will be tolerated, but you will not be protected. In a place like this, that difference is often the line between life and death. And so you learn to live inside these boundaries, to measure your steps not only by your own needs, but by the invisible walls that keep the camp's fragile order intact. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent, when to take and when to give, when to hold your ground and when to step aside. The rules are not fair, not always, but they are consistent enough to navigate. And in a world where so much is unpredictable, the weather, the illness, the whims of those in charge, that consistency is its own form of comfort. You may never write these rules down, but you carry them all the same, as surely as you carry the weight of your own body. And each day you follow them, you stitch yourself a little deeper into the fabric of the camp, knowing that to tear free of it would be to step into a silence from which no one returns. Memory becomes its own kind of shelter in the camp, one that no guard can dismantle, no weather can ruin, no barter can buy. People carry it quietly, as if afraid that speaking it too often will wear it thin. In the still moments, when queues have broken and the fires burn low, you can see it in their eyes, a drifting away from the mud beneath their feet to a street that smells of bread in the morning, to a chair near a window where the light used to fall just so, to a voice calling from another room in a language untouched by the war. These memories are not always perfect. Sometimes they are blurred at the edges. Sometimes they are too sharp in one place and missing entirely in another, but they are constant in their presence, like a hidden pocket stitched into the inside of the mind, a place to slip into when the dirt and the lice and the endless sameness threaten to swallow you whole. Some people feed their memories deliberately, turning them over and over like a small stone in the palm until it becomes smooth. You might hear a man describe the precise sound of his mother's kettle when it began to boil, or the way the light hit the cobblestones after a summer rain in his hometown. These details are small enough to escape envy. They are safe to share, because they do not make promises of return. Others guard their memories fiercely, speaking of them to no one, perhaps afraid that bringing them into the open will make them too real, and thus more painful to lose again. In the camp, privacy is rare, but this kind of privacy, the kind that exists entirely within one's own head, is the most inviolable. Longing is not the same as memory, though the two often walk together here. Memory is a room you can enter. Longing is the window in that room, opening onto a place you cannot reach. Longing is the smell of coffee when you have only water, the sound of a song you know but cannot sing because the words have tangled themselves into silence. It is a hunger that sits just beneath the skin, not sharp enough to stop you from moving, but persistent enough to follow you through every step. Some people learn to quiet it, to dull its edges by focusing on the routines of the camp. Others feed it in secret, letting it grow until it becomes almost a companion, a constant reminder that there is a world beyond the fence, even if it feels impossibly far away. Imagination works differently. It is not tethered to what was, it moves into what could be. There are those who, lying awake at night, build entire houses in their minds, arranging each room, choosing colors for walls, planting imaginary gardens that bloom in impossible patterns. There are children who invent games set in cities they have never seen, with rules that make no sense outside their own minds. There are adults who picture themselves in future kitchens, stirring soups that will never taste of camp rations. Imagination is dangerous in some ways. It can make the present harder to bear, but it also keeps a certain kind of muscle alive, the one that believes in a life beyond survival. Sometimes memory, longing, and imagination braid together so tightly that it is impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. A woman might hum a lullaby her grandmother sang to her, imagining a day when she can sing it to a grandchild of her own, all while remembering the scent of the blanket she was wrapped in as a child. In that moment, past, present, and future fold in on each other, creating a pocket of time that belongs entirely to her. No one can take it away, and no one can enter it without her permission. These inner landscapes are not visible to the casual eye, but if you spend enough time in the camp, you learn to see their outlines. You notice the faraway look someone gets while stirring the same thin stew they have stirred every day for months. You catch the half-smile that appears when a certain word is spoken, even if its meaning is lost to you. You feel the shift in the air when someone is pulled suddenly, violently, out of their inner refuge by a noise or a voice. The loss of that refuge, even for a moment, can be as jarring as the loss of a physical possession. There are dangers to retreating too far into these mental shelters. Some people begin to live there more than they live in the camp itself, their bodies moving through the cues and chores while their minds are far away. They miss opportunities, fail to notice changes, and in a place where vigilance is survival, that distance can be costly. Others guard against this by sharing their inner landscapes in fragments, telling stories to children, describing colors and smells and tastes that are otherwise absent here. In doing so, they anchor themselves to the camp's reality, while still keeping a thread tied to the world inside their heads. The camp itself seems to sense the presence of these hidden worlds, though it cannot touch them directly. Its routines, its demands, its small cruelties all seem designed to pull people outward, to keep their attention fixed on the immediate. But at night, when the fires are low and the voices are fewer, these inner landscapes push back. You can almost feel them rising in the dark. Hundreds of invisible rooms lit by the flicker of memory and hope. Hundreds of quiet gardens blooming where no real flower could survive. And perhaps this is why, despite everything, the dirt, the disease, the unwritten rules, people do not lose themselves entirely here. Because even when the body is trapped in a narrow space with narrow chances, the mind can still wander. It can step over the fence without making a sound. It can walk streets no one here has seen, stand in doorways that no longer exist, sit beside people who may be gone but are alive in the quiet corners of thought. And in that wandering, in that act of holding something untouchable, there is a kind of freedom the camp cannot take. The camp, over time, begins to develop a memory of its own, one that does not belong to any single person but is carried in fragments by everyone who moves through it. It is not written anywhere, yet it shapes the air like the smell of the fires or the weight of the mud after rain. It grows in the retelling of small events, in the half-truths passed along between the water queue and the cooking fire, in the way one person's experience is repeated so many times, it becomes less about the person and more about the lesson it offers. This collective memory is not entirely accurate, Accuracy is a luxury here, but it is persistent, and it gives the camp a sense of continuity that the constant arrivals and departures cannot erase. Newcomers step into it without realizing, picking up its threads and adding their own without ever knowing where the first stitch was made. Some of these memories are warnings, dressed as stories. People speak of the man who tried to hide food beneath his bedding, only for the smell to draw the wrong attention and cost him more than the meal was worth. They tell it without malice, almost gently, as though to say, "We do not want to see this happen to you." Other memories are wrapped in a kind of quiet reverence. The woman who once sang every night until she was too weak to stand. The boy who learned the names of every plant that managed to grow through the fence. These stories are passed in low voices, not because they are secrets, but because speaking them too loudly might somehow diminish them. There are also legends in the camp, if you can call them that, though they have nothing to do with heroics in the traditional sense. They are about people who found ways to bend the camp's unspoken rules without breaking them entirely, who managed to keep a little more warmth in the winter, or coax an extra ladle of soup from the kitchens. Some are about those who left not in shame or death, but in a way that feels almost mythical, disappearing with the quiet precision of a door closing behind them. No one can agree exactly where they went or how they managed it, but the story endures, shifting details as it moves from mouth to mouth. These legends are not promises, they are more like lanterns, small points of light that give shape to the darkness without banishing it. The collective memory also remembers the days when the camp was different, even if different only means the queues were shorter or the guards less watchful. The older residents speak of these times the way one might speak of seasons in a place without weather, marking changes in tone rather than temperature. They describe when the water was cleaner, when the ground was not yet worn to its current hardness, when certain corners of the camp were still empty spaces rather than overcrowded shelters. Whether these recollections are entirely true matters less than the fact that they are shared. They provide a sense that the camp is part of a timeline, not an endless loop, and that time, even here, can bring change. What is striking is how these memories do not belong to their originators alone. A child who was not yet born when a certain event took place might recount it with the confidence of someone who stood there, repeating the words exactly as they were given to them. The boundaries between witness and listener dissolve over time, until the camp's stories feel as if they have been imprinted on the very ground. The dirt itself seems to remember, carrying the echo of footsteps that walked it before, holding the outlines of places that no longer exist except in someone's description. There is an intimacy in the way this memory is kept. It passes in pieces, over bowls of thin stew, in the shade during the hottest days, in the lingering moments before the first light calls everyone back into motion. It is not given all at once. You are allowed into it slowly, as if the camp is watching to see whether you will treat it with care. Those who misuse it, who twist a story for their own advantage, or who break the quiet trust in which it was shared, find themselves excluded from the next retelling. In this way, the memory of the camp is guarded as carefully as any tangible resource. The most enduring parts of this memory are not about events at all, but about feelings. People remember what it was like, the day the wind carried the smell of rain before the first drop fell. They remember the hush that spread when a letter arrived from outside, its envelope soft from being passed through too many hands. They remember the silence after someone's voice was heard for the last time, not just the absence of the sound, but the shape of the space it left behind. These are things that cannot be measured or recorded, yet they live on as clearly as any fact. And just as the camp holds these memories, it also reshapes them. Stories soften or sharpen depending on who tells them. Details are lost or replaced. And over time, the truth is not what matters. It is the persistence of the telling. This is how the camp teaches without teaching, how it warns without issuing commands, how it binds people together without needing to declare that they are bound. You might think you are simply hearing someone talk to pass the time, but weeks later, in a moment when you need it, the shape of that story will rise in your mind and guide your hand, your choice, your step. In this way, the camp's collective memory becomes a second kind of map, not of fences or paths, but of survival. It charts the invisible terrain of what is possible, what is forbidden, what is worth risking. It tells you where caution will serve you and where boldness is your only chance. And though you cannot hold it in your hands or draw it on a page, You carry it with you, as surely as you carry the weight of the air you breathe. Resilience in the camp is not loud, nor is it dressed in the grand gestures that stories outside these fences tend to favor. It moves quietly, almost shyly, in moments that are small enough to be overlooked if you are not paying attention. You might see it in the way someone straightens the edge of a blanket before lying down, as if reminding the world that even here, in a place stripped of comfort, there is still room for order. You might hear it in a sudden burst of laughter, the kind that surprises everyone present, including the one laughing, because it rises up from somewhere untouched by the weight of mud and hunger. It is in the faint hum of a song while water boils, the way a child draws patterns in the dirt with a stick and guards them from being stepped on, as if they are treasures no one else understands. These things are not planned. They happen because something deep inside refuses to be crushed entirely, because a part of the spirit insists on bending rather than breaking. Sometimes, beauty appears in ways that feel almost accidental. A scrap of cloth dyed long ago still holds a faded streak of color, and someone ties it around their wrist, not for warmth but for the way it catches the eye. A flower, stubborn enough to bloom through the compacted dirt near the fence, is noticed and remembered, its location whispered from one person to another, as if it were a secret worth guarding. On cold nights, someone might feed the fire with a little more wood than necessary, just so its glow feels generous rather than stingy, and the shadows it casts grow softer against the shelter walls. These are luxuries here, not in their material worth, but in the decision to create something more than mere survival. Humor, too, finds its way in, though it is not the kind that exists outside these walls. It is sharp, born of shared recognition, the kind that doesn't require explaining because everyone here already knows the shape of the struggle. Someone might make a joke about the endless queues, comparing them to parades from another life. And the laughter that follows is quiet but deep, because it carries the relief of saying aloud what everyone feels. Sometimes the humor is darker, circling the truths no one dares to name directly, and though it leaves a trace of discomfort, it also releases the pressure that builds when words are held in too long. Connection grows in this soil of shared endurance. Two people might meet only in passing each day, their exchange nothing more than a nod or the brief sharing of a task. Yet over time it becomes a thread of familiarity that can be leaned on when the weight of the place feels heavier than usual. There are those who will save a seat near the fire without being asked, or who will stand a little closer in the queue so that the wind cuts less sharply against you. These are not favors traded for return. They are acknowledgments that even here, where scarcity dictates so much, there is still room for the instinct to care. You notice how these moments of resilience stitch themselves into the larger rhythm of camp life. They do not erase the hunger, the lice, the dirt. They cannot, but they create a countercurrent, a quiet defiance that runs beneath the surface of each day. In the evenings, when the light is thin and the air carries the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, you might see people gathered in a small circle, telling stories not about the camp, but about places they have known or imagined. Their faces change in these moments. The lines of fatigue soften, and their voices take on a different weight, as though they are speaking from somewhere beyond the reach of the fence. There are also acts of making, however humble. Someone will weave strands of dried grass into a rope, not because it is needed, but because the act of braiding feels like shaping something in a world that takes more than it gives. Another will carve a small figure from a piece of wood, smoothing it until it feels right in the hand, giving it away without ceremony. These creations may not last, most do not, but while they exist, they are proof that the mind and hands can still work in harmony for something more than necessity. Even the smallest gesture can become an anchor. A shared sip of cleaner water on a hot day. A warning given quietly to avoid a place where tension is brewing. The deliberate act of looking someone in the eye when handing them their portion, reminding them that they are seen. These are not the kinds of acts that make history in the outside world, but here they are, the difference between being pulled under and finding the strength to stay afloat for another day. And sometimes, resilience comes in the form of stillness. A person sitting quietly, not in defeat, but in a kind of deliberate pause, claiming a moment of their own in a place that takes so much, watching the slow drift of clouds, feeling the ground beneath them, listening to the low hum of life moving around them without rushing to join it. In that stillness, There is a kind of reclaiming not of the body's freedom, but of the mind's space to simply be. As these moments accumulate, they become part of the camp's own living fabric, woven between the hardships and the rules and the memories. They are not celebrated loudly. They pass from one day to the next like a quiet thread, holding things together in ways that are felt more than seen. And when you notice them, when you truly notice, you begin to understand that survival here is not built solely on rations and shelter, but on this stubborn, quiet insistence on finding beauty, humor, and connection in a place designed to strip them away. That is how the camp breathes, not only through the bodies it contains, but through the small, defiant sparks that refuse to go out. Hope in the camp is not a single, unchanging thing. It shifts, it bends, it sheds its skin and grows another, until sometimes you barely recognize it from the form it took when you first arrived. At the beginning, hope often wears the shape of escape. It is sharp-edged, almost feverish, the kind that pushes the mind to imagine sudden changes, the crack of an opening gate, the word passed quietly in the dark that tomorrow will be different. It burns hot and bright in newcomers, their eyes scanning fences, their ears straining for rumors, their steps quickened by the idea that they will not be here long. Those who have been here longer rarely try to extinguish this fire. They know it will cool on its own, settling into something slower, steadier, less visible. They have seen enough arrivals to understand that the first hope is a fragile one, too dependent on the mercy of forces beyond the fence, too easily shattered by the long wait of days. As time stretches, hope begins to change its posture. It stops standing at the edge of the camp, looking outward, and starts folding itself inward, into the routines that sustain life here. It no longer says, "I will leave soon," but instead whispers, "I will see another morning." The focus shifts from grand escape to small endurance. From waiting for the day everything changes to ensuring that you will still be standing when that day comes, if it comes at all. This is not surrender. It is an adaptation, a reshaping of the will so that it can survive the long distance without burning itself out. Hope becomes less like a torch and more like an ember, protected in the hollow of the hand, fed just enough to keep it alive. There are people who learn to carry this ember with a kind of quiet mastery. They do not speak of their hope often, and when they do, it is in plain terms, finishing the week without falling ill, finding a way to keep their shoes from giving out, holding on to a single item that connects them to life beyond the fence. To an outsider, these might seem like small things, but here, each is an act of resistance. The ember of hope burns steadily because it is anchored in the attainable, in the daily acts that shape survival. And though it does not flare in the way the early fire does, it has the strength to last longer, to carry its bearer through seasons without breaking. For some, hope becomes intertwined with the camp itself. They stop imagining a life wholly outside of it, and instead begin to dream of ways to make life inside more bearable. They hope for better water, for fewer lice, for a season without sickness sweeping through. They hope for the strengthening of alliances, for the quiet expansion of the little freedoms they have carved out. To someone who has never lived here, such hopes might sound like a narrowing of the spirit, but in truth they are a sign of its stubbornness. To take a place meant to diminish you, and find within it a space to nurture something better, however small, is its own kind of defiance. There are also moments when hope is hidden, disguised as something else entirely. It might appear as a joke shared in the queue, as a carved figure tucked into the corner of a shelter, as a lullaby hummed to a child who is already asleep. These are acts that seem fleeting, but each one carries the suggestion that there is a reason to hold on to gentleness, to beauty, to connection. In this way, hope becomes a thread running through the fabric of the camp's daily life, invisible to the casual glance but strong enough to hold pieces together that might otherwise fray. In darker times, when illness spreads quickly, or when supplies run low, hope can grow almost invisible. It does not vanish, but it burrows deep, retreating into the smallest corners of the mind. In these moments, people stop speaking of better days, not because they no longer believe in them, but because speaking might weaken what is left. Hope becomes a private thing, guarded like the last sip of clean water, brought out only in the quietest hours when it can be held without fear of being stolen or broken. Those who survive such times are often those who know how to hide their hope well, to shield it from the winds that would snuff it out. And then, Unexpectedly, hope can flare again, often in response to something small but undeniable, a letter from outside, a rumor that someone has been relocated, the sight of a new face in the camp whose eyes still hold that first bright fire. Even those who have long since learned to temper their expectations can feel the spark catch for a moment, warming places inside that had grown cold. This flare is dangerous because it can burn too hot and leave behind the ash of disappointment, but it is also necessary. Without it, the ember might cool too much, and once extinguished, it is far harder to rekindle. Over time, you come to understand that hope here is not a straight line. It is a tide. It rises and falls. It advances and retreats. It changes shape with the seasons and with the fortunes of the camp. Some days it feels like a steady companion, walking beside you with quiet assurance. Other days it feels like something you must drag behind you, heavy and reluctant. But even in its weakest moments, it is present, woven into the way people look at each other, into the care taken over a shared meal, into the persistence of telling stories of the outside world. This is the final transformation of hope in the camp. It becomes part of the identity of survival itself. No longer a separate thing you carry in your hands. It lives in the way you move, the way you speak, the way you prepare for the day ahead. It is no longer only about leaving. It is about outlasting, about being here when others are not, about holding a place in the world, even if that place is confined by wire and watchful eyes, until you can step into another one. And in this form, hope is almost unbreakable, because it is no longer tied to the moment of escape, but to the act of enduring. And endurance is something the camp, in all its harshness, has already been teaching you since the day you arrived. And so, the camp breathes on, in its own slow, uneven rhythm, a living organism made of countless footsteps, murmured words, small trades, and the unspoken agreements that hold it together. The dirt remains, as it always has, folding itself into the seams of clothes and the lines of skin until it feels like part of you, until you cannot tell where your own body ends and the ground begins. The lice, tireless and indifferent, move through the fibers of blankets and hair, their presence a constant hum beneath the larger noises of the place. The seasons still come, each rewriting the camp's terms: dust into mud, heat into cold, hunger into deeper hunger, and people still shift to meet them, bending and bending without quite breaking. The rules hold, invisible but heavy, and the quiet punishments wait like shadows for those who forget their shape. Memory continues its work, both private and shared, storing what has happened in the pockets of the mind and in the camp's own collective fabric, so that even when the people change, the stories remain. Resilience, sometimes no more than the tightening of a blanket or the curve of a smile in passing, knits itself into the days. And hope, now ember, now tide, keeps finding new ways to exist in the narrow space between the possible and the impossible. If you were to walk through it now, as night begins to fall, you might see it all at once, though not in the way a camera would. You would see the light of a small fire reflecting in someone's eyes as they stir water into something warm enough to drink, their hands moving without hurry. You would see a child tracing a pattern in the dirt that will vanish by morning, a game played with no expectation of permanence. You would see two people leaning close, their heads almost touching, exchanging words so quietly that the air between them must strain to hold them. You would see someone sitting alone, watching the way the last light catches the edge of the fence, their gaze steady but somewhere far beyond it. You would see the camp itself holding its breath, waiting for the night to deepen so that its quieter life can unfold trades made in shadow, grief tended in silence, the stubborn rituals of care repeated, because they are all that can be repeated. The camp has taught everyone here, in ways they might never have wanted to learn, that survival is not a single act but an unending chain of them, linked so tightly that breaking one can loosen the rest. It has taught that dignity is not a luxury but a muscle, one that must be used every day to keep from withering. It has taught that connection, even in its smallest form, a nod, a shared glance, the pressing of a cup into another's hand, is as necessary as food or warmth. And it has taught that hope, for all its shifting shapes, is less fragile when it is shared, even if only in the flicker of a moment. These are not lessons that will appear in any history book, but they live here, in the way people walk, in the way they speak, in the way they keep something of themselves untouched by the place. If you listen closely, there is also another sound softer than the coughs, quieter than the shuffle of feet. It is the sound of thoughts moving forward, past the fences, past the watchful eyes, past the weight of the rules. It is the part of each person that refuses to stay entirely here, even while the body has no choice. Some of them imagine streets they once knew. Some imagine streets they have never seen. Some imagine nothing more than the next morning's light falling on their face without a shadow across it. These thoughts do not change the camp, but they change the one who carries them, and that is enough. One day, perhaps, some of these people will step beyond this place for the last time. They will carry with them the habits the camp pressed into them, the way to measure water without wasting a drop, the instinct to read a room before speaking, the understanding that survival is built on the smallest of acts repeated without fail. They will carry its memories, too, both the ones they will tell and the ones they will keep to themselves. And they will carry the knowledge that even in the narrowest of worlds, there is still space for beauty, humor, connection, and hope if you are willing to look for them. That is the camp's final, unspoken truth. It cannot take everything, though it will try. Something always remains. And maybe, as you listen to this, you find yourself wondering not about the fences or the guards or the dirt, but about that something. What would yours be if the walls closed in and the seasons turned without mercy? What would you hold on to when almost everything else had been taken? Would it be a memory, worn smooth from turning it over in your mind? Would it be a ritual, small and unremarkable to anyone else, but enough to anchor you? Would it be the hope that has changed shape 100 times, but still glows faintly in the dark? Or would it be something you have not yet imagined, waiting quietly for the day you need it? I will leave you with that thought, my friend. Let it settle where it will, and if it stays with you into the quiet hours, that is fine. These are the kinds of questions that do not demand quick answers. And if you wish to return here, to walk again through these narrow paths and listen to the stories the camp keeps in its shadows, you know where to find me. I will be here, speaking softly, carrying the threads of memory forward. Until then, rest well, and keep your ember close.